colleagues, I wasn't going to speak during this discussion, but as a former civil rights attorney, I do feel compelled to state the record straight on a number of things. First of all, it was suggested that 50 years ago in the Reynolds v. Sims Supreme Court case, that somehow stood for the premise that we should not consider our immigrants as far as a population count. And let me just cite the most famous line from that Reynolds v. Sims case. Chief Justice Warren stated that legislators represent people, not trees or acres. I happen to be one of the members of this body who think that regardless of your immigration status, you are a person. There may be some in this room who may disagree with that statement, but I happen to think that that's the case. And let me further state that the key ruling in that Supreme Court case was that the population must be addressed when it comes to these considerations. Again, I happen to think that immigrants, regardless of your immigration status, should be considered in that population. We know that the context 50 years ago for this jurisprudence came on the heels of a history of African Americans being considered to be 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportionment. And colleagues, if the Supreme Court goes one direction with this case, we could see literally almost 40% of the population in our state being disenfranchised, the bringing back the 3/5 rule into our Supreme Court jurisdiction. And I would like to take an opportunity and respond to our colleagues from Nicholas's point around whether non-citizens should have the right to vote and correct you on one other point of history. It is actually true in our U.S. history, under the Supreme Court, for 150 years, non-citizens were allowed to vote. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that citizenship status is not essential to the vote. What's important is whether states or localities grant that right to vote. In fact, that was the case from the beginning of our country's history until the 1920s. And who was allowed to vote? It was actually white European property owners, regardless of citizenship status, who were actually granted the right to vote. And in fact, over the last 30 years in the United States, New York City, Chicago, several cities and towns in Massachusetts, several cities and towns in Maryland have allowed immigrants to vote based on this Supreme Court jurisdiction, based on the sense that we need to be inclusive, particularly at a time when we have millions of residents who are not citizens because of a failure in Washington, D.C. for certain legislators to be able to move forward and put together comprehensive immigration reform. So with that, I'm a strong supporter of this measure. I think we need to do it. I think it will dramatically change the face, not just of what our state is about, not just what our country is about. It will send absolutely the wrong signal about who we consider as people, who we consider as part of our population, and who it is that we serve.